Welcome everyone to my channel. Today I have a really long video for you guys, much longer than usual, but very detailed, and hopefully it will give you some great information about how to heal yourself.
The common symptoms are brain fog, cognitive dysfunction, mood issues, sleep issues, autoimmune, inflammatory problems, joint pain, fatigue.
Migraines, severe hypertension, cardiac arrhythmias, unusual periods, lots of abdominal pain, joint pain, fatigue.
The most important issue is that mold and all of the other critters that live inside wet buildings will do is to create a collection of symptoms. It won't be one. It might be one that's noticed, but over time, gradually, days pass, weeks pass, the symptoms grow up until a mean number of symptoms, an average symptom burden of about 20.
Once the mold is growing someplace in your house, it's going to release these mycotoxins. The toxins are poisons. They are chemicals. You can't kill them. Right? They are what are causing the problem in mold illness. And they float around your house, and they can deposit themselves on your furniture, on your books, on your possessions, on your clothing. Some people will move, or they'll remediate their house, but they don't take care of the possessions. And so the mold is still there, and it's still floating around, and the toxin from the mold poisons the people.
The molds are part of the total environmental load. And if you picture yourself as a barrel, molds, pesticides, solvents, bacteria, viruses all fill that barrel. And then the mold gets excess from your house or your office or your work. It may spill over, and then you start getting symptoms, screw up your immune system and your enzyme detoxification systems, and then cause illness or dysfunction.
Concentration can cause you to lose words when you're talking, can reduce short-term memory in time, can cause reduction in long-term memory. It can cause you to become disoriented, where you forget your own name for a few seconds, or you can be driving around in your neighborhood and kind of look like, where am I, for a few seconds, until you track. Yeah, it can be devastating. And we have patients that have lost their jobs because their cognitive abilities had declined so much that they were unable to perform their duties. Psychological symptoms, they abound. Minimal would be just mood swings. People don't feel well, they're cranky, they don't sleep well, they tend to get set off very easily.
I just lost interest in everything. Just the ensuing depression and anxiety just like took over everything. I couldn't concentrate at all. I would stare at my guitar for months and just not even touch it. I just kind of withdrew.
Changes we look for, we call them mood swings. Some people will get down and would have suicidal thoughts. Other people get agitated beyond agitated.
So one of the areas that's also damaged with mold is an area called the amygdala. So the amygdala is underneath your temples and behind your eyes. Little almond-shaped structure that when that is damaged, people can have rage for no reason. And it can devastate their relationships, it can devastate their work, and people will judge them as bad when they're really not bad, they're sick.
The role of the amygdala during emotional processing in Huntington's disease, from pre-manifest to manifested disease. The combined results of these studies suggest that the amygdala is affected early in the course of HD, even from the late pre-manifest stage. So before you really show your significant movement symptoms is when this really occurs.
100 years ago, coal miners would take a canary into the mine with them. Not for the songs, but because when the toxic gases in the mine got strong enough to kill the canary, they knew they had only minutes to get out, even though they couldn't detect it. It turns out that about 28% of people are genetically canaries for toxic mold.
We did draw some laboratory markers, and those came back that we had some genotypes that were considered dreaded, and that our kids now had as well.
So here it shows that there are reactive properties that express the histocompatibility of the glycoprotein HLA-DR, and they were detected in many neurological diseases, including Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Pick's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, dementia of Guam, ALS, and many, many more. This is more research about HLA B27, which is a different HLA gene, but it will help us understand better how this affects autoimmune disease. For those that don't know, you should probably look it up, but Huntington's is an autoimmune disease as well. There are numerous environmental factors that have been implicated in the development of autoimmune disease, including antibiotic use, birth by cesarean section, and chemicals that we encounter in our food and on the dishes that we use to cook and eat our food. This just goes on to tell a little bit more about how it affects the gut. What is it that affects the gut? Well, HLA is short for human leukocyte antigen. Leukocytes are the white blood cells responsible for protecting the body from infection and foreign substances. Antigen in this case refers to how it works against us sometimes. Our immune systems in autoimmune disease actually attack us. And this explains a little bit more about how that works and the different haplotypes that might be involved, because there are so many different haplotypes, but I believe that they're all genetically related by blood. Because here it shows it's not a very common haplotype. Only 8% of Caucasians, 4% of South Africans, 2 to 9% of Chinese, and 0.1 to 0.5% of Japanese people possess this, which doesn't really surprise me because of all the research I've done, but it's definitely notable. So basically it says here it's an increased risk with inflammation. And that's the biggest thing. For Huntington's disease in particular, the inflammation is quite high. So here it shows the study that they did showing the analysis of what it looks like to have an HLA dependent gut, I suppose you could say it that way. There's a problem with the bacterial. See, in our guts, we have a lot of different types of bacteria that live there and feed off of each other and work with each other. But sometimes when the bacteria is out of whack in your gut and the fungi is out of whack, well, then your gut cannot operate at its optimal functioning level, which is why a low-starch diet might help. And this goes more into the science about carbohydrates. This is something that I really want to discuss with you. The science of carbohydrates is so important because the simple sugars and the polysaccharides from vegetables and fruits and all kinds of starchy vegetables can really cause a problem in our gut. So this study is just talking about how that works and why we can't really break down the simple sugars that are needed for energy and growth, like some other people who don't have genetics that are affected by HLA or mold. Here, the study is showing its conclusion that the low-carb group actually had a decline in symptom severity, and in some cases, there was complete remission of this disease using this way of eating. So if we ate this way for autoimmune diseases and Huntington's diseases, how much better would we feel? What do the experts say about this? Genetic testing reveals any sort of histamine problems that you might have, any genetic coding that might have to do with histoincompatibility in your body. But this kind of testing is additional to the blood work that we've already had to determine whether or not we have Huntington's disease or possibly an autoimmune disease. So you will need to get additional testing to find out that information from 23andMe or see a geneticist in order to find out that information. This can cost you anywhere from $100 to $200. So instead of doing that, some people, like myself, have decided to go ahead and self-experiment and find out whether or not this is really our issue. I experimented and found out it was mine.
Did you know that nearly everyone today is dealing with a condition known as leaky gut, thanks to our modern environment and lifestyle? It's behind so many unexplained symptoms that go far beyond the digestive tract. It can cause symptoms from your skin to your brain. And leaky gut is thought to be the main precursor to autoimmune diseases and other chronic conditions. I see it in virtually all of my patients who haven't already gone through some sort of gut repairing program. And for that reason, I want to talk to you today about what is leaky gut, how you develop it, and why it matters. Now, our gut is the gateway to health. And I say that because nearly 60 to 80% of our immune system sits in our gut. And 95% of our neurotransmitters, serotonin, which is our feel-good hormone, is made in our gut. So what is leaky gut? Well, our gut naturally sits together with these tight junctions that hold our gut together. We digest and absorb through our teeny tiny villi. Now, these tight junctions can open just a little bit. They're semi-permeable, so they allow small, teeny tiny macro and micronutrients in. It's how we naturally digest and absorb our food. So I like to think of the gut like a drawbridge. The teeny tiny boats can get in. The things we want to are micro and macronutrients, but large boats that are not supposed to get through unless a signal happens can't get through. So what causes those bridges or those tight junctions to open up? There are various things that can cause it to open up. One of them is a very inflammatory food called gluten. In fact, we know through the research of Alessio Fasano that when gluten comes onto the tight junction, it releases something called zonulin, which allows those tight junctions to stay open, or that drawbridge to stay open. And then large food particles that were never meant to get through do. I'll explain more about that in a second. So what are some of these inflammatory foods that can cause these tight junctions to open up? We know gluten can, likely dairy or the casein molecule can, and grains and legumes and nuts and seeds for some people can as well. And then of course there are toxic foods like alcohol and sugar and caffeine. And we want to avoid things like packaged foods and GMOs. We're learning so much more about GMO or genetically modified foods. Those too can be very irritating to the gut, can disrupt our microbiome, and even open up those tight junctions. Now, one of the biggest things that I see in my clinic that allows those tight junctions to open up are gut infections like Candida or SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and even parasites. Toxins, medications, there's certain medications that can allow those tight junctions to open up as well. Antibiotics, NSAIDs or anti-inflammatories like Motrin, steroids, acid-reducing drugs, and even stress. Research is showing that age and stress can cause these tight junctions to open up, allowing those larger boats to get through. Now, what happens when these big boats get through? Well, they get into our bloodstream. What I didn't tell you is that in your gut, there's only one cell layer thick, and then there's our immune system. And right after that is our bloodstream. So when those tight junctions open up, then large microbes, toxins, infections, food particles that were never meant to get into our bloodstream do. They come straight over because the tight junctions or the canal has been opened up. Now, you might be wondering, what are some symptoms of leaky gut? Well, first of all, of course you can have digestive symptoms like gas, bloating, diarrhea, have a diagnosis of IBS or IBD. But let me tell you, so many people that I see that actually have leaky gut don't even have any digestive symptoms whatsoever.
Many people also suffer from joint pain, which includes pain in the knee, hips, hands, and elbows. Redness of the skin and skin lesions, or eczema or psoriasis, are also other clues. The Candida growth cycle runs in a vicious loop constantly unless you can break the cycle.
Some of the main symptoms are food allergies, irritability, yeast infections, sugar cravings, lack of concentration, swelling or constipation, fatigue, headaches, a thick white coating on your tongue, depression, skin rashes such as eczema, acne, immune system disorders.
There are many grains, vegetables, and fruits that grow mold, such as this coconut. Coconuts fall from the tree and land on the ground to mold before and during harvest. When the harvesters pick up the coconuts, they are put with the rest of the harvest instead of being discarded, thereby contaminating the entire harvest with mold. This is something that happens with fruits, vegetables, and definitely grains, because many grains are grown with mycotoxins, and then they are harvested with the mycotoxins, and then stored in silos with the mycotoxins. This causes a really big disease problem.
Most of my life, I have struggled with some autoimmune issues. Very, very young, at an early age, I actually had an outbreak of psoriasis, and basically my whole body was covered in red patchy scales, from head to toe. I don't know what initially set that off, but throughout my life, I've had, little patches show up on my skin here and there. And then several times throughout my life during, stressful times or who knows what exactly why, but, I've had kind of an outbreak where my whole body has just been covered in these red, really painful, awful scales that I've had to deal with and try to live life normally with. And obviously that has led to lots of dermatology visits, lots of doctor's visits, trying to figure out what on earth is going on and how to fix them. Obviously their solutions are usually immunosuppressant medications that I was unwilling to take. Quite health conscious, and I felt like every other area of my life I was, really focused on being healthy. I'm very active. And always tried to eat fairly well, but just could not shake mainly the psoriasis. Not only did this affect my skin, but it also affected my joint health. I have, technically arthritic psoriasis. So my joints were inflamed consistently. I remember there being days where I would wake up and I couldn't even open my hands. It would take me just a really long time to get going, in my younger years. So, that's been a big challenge throughout my entire life. On top of all of that, I've had, pretty much lots of little things that I never really thought much about, but they started adding up about 10 years ago. I just started noticing, extreme muscle fatigue after a workout. Rather than just being sort of sore, I was extremely sore after workouts. I noticed lots of joint pain. I've had bad knees my whole life, but I was starting to feel as though my joints were deteriorating. And I should also mention that during this time, I was actually moving more toward like a plant-based approach in my eating style. And so I noticed myself just a few years ago hardly being able to walk up and down the stairs. Again, even though I'm very active and feel very strong and healthy in every way, that was starting to wear on me quite a bit. I have struggled with constipation my whole life and just digestion issues in general, lots of bloating and just discomfort. And I could never quite dial in what exact foods were the problem source for me. And just always, again, felt like my stomach was uncomfortable and never could process my food well. I've struggled with Candida in the past and yeast infections and all kinds of overgrowths as far as that goes. And so obviously something is not working right in my gut. Let's see, I've had cold sores and dry and cracking lips, dry hair and nails, and, just in general, dealing with a feeling of not being healthy and could never really pinpoint what those things were. A few years ago, I started really noticing that I was having almost like mental issues where I felt like I couldn't quite remember things, or I was feeling slightly depressed, even though that was never really something I've dealt with before in my life. Having some mood swings, feeling just foggy headed and had a hard time functioning when it came to my work. Very disorganized in my thoughts. So my brain just didn't feel like it was firing properly for me. And then I also started to notice, things like receding gums, and then, just being sick all the time. I was getting sinus infections or colds, anytime anything's going around, I've picked it up. My whole life, I've actually had sinus infections about 4 times a year. So anytime the weather changes, I'm sick and just having to, be down and out for a couple of weeks, not feeling well. So that's basically been most of what I've dealt with my whole life. And again, I saw those things progressively getting worse.
How did you implement the carnivore diet? What did you start out eating, and what do you eat as a typical day now? And is there anything that you found within the meat-based arena that you can't have?
I felt very confused about the whole thing because, again, there's a lot of again, knowledge that I thought I had around the plant-based way of eating. And so I had to really shift my mindset around that. So I did start timidly, I guess you could say, where I ate everything that was animal based. And so was eating a lot of eggs and a lot of dairy and a lot of these other things, thinking that I needed to have all of that in order to get the nutrients that I needed, or even just to satisfy cravings or whatever that might be. So I did start out mostly just focusing on beef and I guess I started out eating just about everything. So beef, chicken, pork, eggs, dairy, and fish. And kind of, yes, had some digestion issues. My body had to change how it digested all of that food. So I would say for about a month, I really felt almost worse for.
It is not uncommon to experience a Hertzheimer or healing reaction at the beginning of starting a carnivore diet, but it is short-lived.
I immediately started to feel better when I shifted my diet within a few days when it came to my thoughts and my mental capacity, like what was going on up here was improving, and my energy levels were improving, and I just started to feel a little healthier in my body. But my digestion issues took about a month or so to sort themselves out. And then it kind of just happened suddenly, where I just became, all the bloating went away and I didn't have any more discomfort. I haven't had any digestion issues whatsoever or discomfort. bloating or any of that in like 2 years now. So that's amazing. But over time, I didn't quite see my autoimmune issues shifting. So I saw all these other things improving, but I noticed that my autoimmune issues, my psoriasis, you know, the parts of my body that I felt like were struggling the most, those were not really getting better. So I just started experimenting with cutting back more and more and more, and eventually cut out eggs, cut out chicken, cut out pork, and cut out dairy. And so I pretty much was eating beef, some organ meats, liver basically, and fish almost exclusively. So just beef and fish, salt, water, a little coffee here and there. And that, within a couple weeks of doing that, my psoriasis pretty much went away completely, and I have yet to notice any changes or problems with that since. So that was the biggest thing for me, was cutting out all that other stuff. And then over time, I've kind of gradually added some things back in, but what I would say is if I notice anything, or if I feel myself having any issues, going back to, good cuts of salmon and nice grass-fed, grass-finished red meat, and liver and salt and water is about, it's kind of a reset in a way.
Awesome. So you mentioned some of the improvements, like your digestion and the psoriasis and all. But what other things did you notice once you implemented the carnivore diet? What are more changes that you can talk about?
And so I noticed my body composition changing. So again, even though I've been in fitness, I've worked out most of my life, I noticed I could work out less and not really lose my strength and my body composition that, I used to have to work so hard for. So I was able to kind of relax into that a bit and just enjoy the fact that I knew I was eating foods that were only what I really needed and nothing more than that. And so my body is just kind of stabilized when it comes to my weight. And again, my strength levels, I feel like I've been able to maintain that without working out harder. So my skin has improved quite a bit. I've noticed, like, just again, my hair, nails, just joints, all of that have felt amazing. I just, I'm 40 this year, and I feel my joints are healthier than they ever have been. So I feel just like young and capable of jumping, which is, something I couldn't have done 5 years ago. Mood has improved drastically. I feel just like I have a general more positive outlook on life. I've never thought that I've had a negative outlook on life, but I definitely feel like I just feel calm and happy and generally just have a positive outlook on life rather than a more anxious, stressed outlook on life.
So how long have you been carnivore?
In my meat, and when I need maybe a little less fat in my meat. So just kind of getting to a place where I really feel like I understand my diet. It took me about a year. So I think about 2 years in. Besides that, the thing I was shocked by, I didn't expect, and I don't think I even realized that I was dealing with, was the fact that I was getting a cold or having a sinus infection, every time the seasons change. So 3 or 4 times a year, I was getting sick, thinking that was normal, thinking that, we all get sick when the weather gets colder.
A common symptom of Candida is chronic sinus infections.
Season again, those things are, we've become trained to just believe that's normal, and it's not. And I have felt pretty amazing for 2 years straight. So
now that we've heard a success story, let's take a look at what the experts have to say about this diet.
In a number of cultures that people lived almost entirely on animal foods. Maasai warriors in Africa, Eskimos, and Alaskan people. The further north you go, The less plants were consumed, the more animal foods were consumed, and the higher the fat content was of the diet. And these were some of the healthiest people that were in existence on our planet. And I have discovered that through my experience in my clinic. I had a group of babies and children with ulcerative colitis, with Crohn's disease, and other severe digestive disorders. No matter what we did with these children, they were not recovering. They could not digest any amount of plant food. Because plant foods are indigestible and they have many anti-nutrients in them, which damage the gut, damage the gut wall, and the fiber in them can be irritating and damaging for a very sensitive digestive system. So what I've tried with some of these children, I've removed all plants from their diet. Entirely. Not a leaf, not a speck, anything from the plant kingdom they could consume, nothing. These children live on meat stock, on boiled meats, on fish, on eggs, on fermented dairy, sour cream, beer, cheese. I have children who have been on this diet now for 4 or 5 years. Healthy, beautiful darlings. Ulcerative colitis gone. Medication is gone. Inflammatory markers are gone. Doctors can't believe what's happening. Majority of these families are afraid to tell their doctors what they're doing. They don't tell their doctors that the child's on a special diet, so doctors are scratching their head and wondering why this child is recovering, or why the child is off medication. Autism is going in these children. They're doing beautifully, these children.
Human brain and the human body have been on this planet for many, many, many eons, right? It has had to go through desperate times, very lean times, long periods of not having much to eat at all. Sometimes we feast and sometimes we fast, right? The human brain and the human body, in fact, has developed 2 separate systems in order to fuel itself. One is burning glucose, which we all know about, and what we've been doing in America for the last 50, 60 years is eating a very high-carb, whole-grain diet, and our body runs on that. We don't die if we eat that, but more and more the research is coming out to show that we probably suffer long-term with increased epidemics of chronic disease, of autoimmune disease, and of dementia. So what you want to do is, since your brain can use 2 separate fuel systems, the first one's glucose, the second one is ketones, right? Our brain has developed this method as a strategy so that when we go through periods of fasting or starvation, when there's just no food around, our brain can switch right over to burning ketones for energy, as can the rest of our body. This is a natural thing. This is not something new. This is something that's been going on since human beings have been human beings on this planet, okay? So your brain is perfectly happy to burn glucose, and it's also perfectly happy to burn ketones. It doesn't really care which it burns as long as it has one or the other. Now, there's a theory about dementia and Alzheimer's that as people age, as people get older, their brain gets worse and worse at using glucose to fuel itself. It becomes almost unable to efficiently burn glucose as energy anymore. And so the theory is that people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, their brain's actually starving to death because these people are eating these high carb, whole grain diets, and they're not eating any good saturated fats. And so the body it doesn't have enough ketones to fuel the brain. And so even though the person looks like they're well fed, the brain is actually starving.
Ketones bridge the brain gap. So we're going to go back one slide, and I want you to take a look at this in hopes that you remember one of the other slides that I spent a lot of time unpacking, which is this study saying when we studied glucose and ketones, we found that in healthy brains that unlike what I learned in medical school, ketones are preferred over glucose when they're available. It's really important that you pay attention to those words, when they're available. If all your brain has for fuel is glucose, by golly, it will use a ton of glucose. But if you look at that red line way at the bottom, those ketones on day 4 and how red that brain is, that is 4 days into a strict ketogenic diet in healthy people where they found their ketones were very high by day 4, and look at how much of their brain is being fueled by ketones. So that's healthy brains. Today we're going to talk about ketones and how they bridge this brain gap when it comes to energy. So as a physician studying internal medicine, I get to see lots of brains that are aging. So in this study, they looked at a ketogenic diet using medium chain triglycerides. And they're here to show, the study shows that it increases the brain metabolism in Alzheimer's disease. And we bring this up because that last slide and that last slide deck that I did a whole lecture on, it really focused on healthy brains. And people say, well, what about mine? I have depression, I have bipolar, I have Parkinson's, I have a tremor. And so I picked one of the most diseased brains, one of the toughest brains to talk to patients about, which is Alzheimer's. And that's what this study focuses on. So we're going to start by looking at this slide where it shows the brain energy. So this might be obvious, but your brain should have 100% energy. All the cells in your brain should be fueled. So this chart just focuses on the 70% brain fuel, 80% brain fuel, 90% brain fuel, and 100% brain fuel. So what happens in brains that aren't working very well is they don't have enough fuel for all of the cells. We call this a brain energy gap. And this is represented here by this white box. Think of this line at the bottom as the 88th percent. At 88% of the fuel for the brain, it does not work so well. And in Alzheimer's, that's very well studied, that when they get below 88%, their memory lapses. They're not doing very well. There's several other studies that show that brain fuel is not doing so well when brains become insulin resistant, which is why this study is applicable for the rest of you. So let's take a look at this chart. It shows that these are this young, healthy control group. So unlike the rest of the charts that you're going to see here, these people were young, and you can see that their brain fuel goes all the way to the top. The red part of the bar is the part of their brain that was fueled by glucose. That top little 5% is the part that was fueled by ketones. And you can see that there's a zero energy gap. They have 100% of their brain being fueled. That sounds pretty ideal. Yep, they were young and healthy. Now we took an older set, but they didn't have any memory problems. We tested their memory, and they performed just great. But these next several bars, including this one, are folks in their 70s, up into their 80s. So if you look, that glucose supplies the brain with 89% of its needed fuel. So it's just 1% over what it needs to be for nobody to notice that anything's wrong with their brain. They have 3% of their brain using ketones, and they have 8% of their brain that's going without fuel. And this is the part that's hidden. Even though these older folks tested normal, when we looked at their PET scans, we could see that there was 8% of their brain cells that had no fuel to do the things that they were asking it to do. And that's the part that I think is the scariest. In Alzheimer's, in brains that age, there is this hidden component that lingers for years before patients have symptoms. These phases of not having symptoms happen in other diseases as well, but I think Alzheimer's demonstrates it the best. And there's a ton of research on it, so I have good scans and good graphs for you. Let's now look at somebody with mild memory problems. So again, this would be considered mild cognitive disease. So if I was doing a test of their memory, I would say that they didn't outright fail it, they just scored low enough on the memory test and low enough on that screening test for Alzheimer's that I'm a little worried. I'm not sure that driving a car might be the best idea. There'll be some other things that I'm worrying about in a patient who scores with mild cognitive impairment. If you'll look though, look at that fuel. It has sunk down to 85% of that brain is being fueled by glucose. Still 3% is being fueled by ketones, and it is under that 88% threshold. That's where that memory problem shows up. And when folks come in and say, hey, I just have a little bit of a problem on that memories test, I think I can try harder. What I want them to focus on is there is a larger gap of your brain that's going without fuel. And there is an answer that you can do to bridge this gap, this missing energy gap. The title is going to give it away. All right, let's move on to people who had this mild cognitive problem, and they took 30 grams of MCT every day. This went on for a month, and we studied their brain scans as they looked at the increasing rise in ketones in their blood, and then watch what happens to the increase in their energy fuel for their brain. So first of all, they were down to 84% of their glucose, of their brain was being fed by glucose. So again, that's much lower than it should be. Their ketones, though, had risen to 7% of their brain fuel was now being used to bridge the gap of energy. They were down to only 9% of a gap in their energy gap, whereas the people without any MCT had closer to 12%. Last but not least, we have the column that shows you what happens if they did 45 grams of MCT. For those of you that are new to keto, MCT stands for medium chain triglycerides, and these are very special fats that slip through the intestine without a traditional way of being absorbed and digested. They actually are ported through the portal vein. They're ported to your liver, and they turn into ketones. After you consume MCT, it does take about half an hour to an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, to get the ketones into your circulation, to measure them in your circulation. But that medium chain triglyceride are ketones made by your liver, but they are supplied by this very special size fat that is 8 carbons or 10 carbons long. I have another video on that, and I'm going to not get distracted with that detail. So if you look at these folks with the 45 grams of MCT, and again, they were the folks who tested with mild cognitive impairment. They weren't the severe Alzheimer's. This is just mild cognitive impairment. And they too fell below that threshold for meeting the needs of their brain. Their glucose was 84% of the brain was being fueled by glucose. And when they added 45 grams of MCT, 10% of their brain was fueled by ketones. This left only 6% of their brain to have a brain energy gap. I would just point out that the people who were testing normally, these folks tested their brain scans showed even more of their brain being properly fueled, meeting the demands that their brain was asking for. Now, this can get a little sciencey and you can get a little overwhelmed, but I just want you to really focus on that we're talking about brain energy here. And brain energy is almost always fueled by glucose when you're not on a ketogenic diet. In fact, in medical school, I believed and I was taught that brains can only use glucose. It's just that time right before you die when you're starving to death that you'd ever use a ketone in the brain. That's what I was taught. But here indeed, as we've continued to learn about the ketogenic diet and why it's so powerful in the anti-seizure movements and in other brain disorders, it's this next part that is powerful. So there is your ketone, there is your glucose columns for the healthy people on the far right or far left. And then as you move across, all of them have are in their 70s, except for that first column. The second column did not have a memory problem. The other 3 did. So as you look, here's that part that has the brain energy gap. Again, anything below 88% was going to show up positive on my test. If 88% of the cells in their brain were properly fueled, then I couldn't find the memory problem. But if there was any part missing, then I saw this brain energy gap. As we look at what happens in healthy people, you can feel that top 5% with ketones in the healthy people. You can feel about 3% in the elderly that were still testing normally in their memory problems. And as we move forward into those, the middle column did not have any supplements. They did have mild cognitive disorder, and they had a large 12% of their brain was starving, screaming for fuel. We moved that, we bridged the gap with ketones in the column that's number 4, and we bridged it even better when we increased the dose of medium chain triglycerides to 94% of their brain was properly fueled. This is an incredible and remarkable finding to say, when I first learned about Alzheimer's, we didn't have any idea that they could use a different fuel. We talk about Alzheimer's as being a brain that's not working well. And the studies that looked into this really poured energy into finding out, are we certain that these elderly brains that aren't working right can use a different fuel? And the PET scans found in this study really were there's multiple studies out there, but this one was a very nicely done study to show. When I look at the other parts of a brain disorder that I think are super important, they include things like, doc, I can't focus. I have memory problems and I don't think it's Alzheimer's. I had a brain injury. I had a concussion. I have chronic headaches. I have depression. I suffer with anxiety. My mood goes up and down. This list of symptoms are all chronic swelling found in brains. From concussions to addiction, to migraines to sleep disorders, these brains are swollen and they're not healthy. when we look at how can we bridge the ketone bridge gap, how can ketones bridge the gap, the important part that I like to have folks remember is this is a very big finding for people when they're struggling.
We used to think that the brain, once it was formed, once you were 25 or so and your brain was fully developed, that was it. You never made new neurons or brain cells, that was the brain that you carried with you for the rest of your life. We now know that that's absolutely false. About every third year, you have completely replaced the cells in your brain, okay? So every 3 years, you have a new brain. And so with that being said, that's a very important concept to understand. Not only are we just trying to fuel our brain, we're having to rebuild our brain every 2 to 3 years. And so that makes it, what you eat, vitally important, because you're not just trying to put fire wood in the fire. You're actually having to rebuild the fireplace every 2 to 3 years. And in order to do that, you have to feed your body the proper things, or you can't rebuild your brain properly. And that could lead to long-term chronic issues like dementia. Your brain is made of fat, and your cell membranes are made of fat and cholesterol. Okay? So if your brain is made of fat and you rebuild your brain every 3 years, then wouldn't you need fat to rebuild your brain with? Wouldn't you need cholesterol to make those new cell membranes with? You see my point? And so now that we know that the brain is not a static thing that never changes, it changes all the time. You're making new brain cells every day. And every third year, you've completely replaced your brain with new cells. So you've got to eat fat. You have to eat good, healthy, saturated fat to rebuild your brain with, to build the cell membranes of every cell in your body, right? The nuclear membranes have to have fat or they cannot be rebuilt. So it's really silly to say you need to eat a super low-fat diet. In fact, when you look at the curve of dementia, right, it follows perfectly with the curve of people eating high-carb, whole-grain diets. It's the same curve. So maybe there might be a connection there, right? We know that now experts are starting to call dementia diabetes of the brain, because it looks like the brain itself becomes resistant to the glucose, and the insulin can't push it into the brain cells anymore. So it looks just like type 2 diabetes of the brain. So why don't we just rethink the way we feed our brain and start feeding our brain what it actually needs, which is healthy, saturated fats. Studies are showing more and more every day that even small increases in blood sugar levels can really increase your risk of developing dementia. And so type 2 diabetics are at super high risk of developing dementia later in life or even earlier in life. So it's really important that you understand that your brain is made of fat. You replace your brain every 2 to 3 years, and if you don't feed your body the right materials, the right brain-building materials to rebuild your brain, then you're going to rebuild an inferior brain, which is more likely to develop dementia later on.
But as soon as we try to add a tiny bit of a vegetable, maybe a little square of courgette, cooked in a big pot of soup and then blends it, diarrhea comes back. Behaviors come back. Eye contact disappears. Tummy pain comes back. We have to stop. We try to ferment the vegetables very, very well, to pre-digest them with fermenting cultures, and then cook it in a soup very well. Some children manage to digest that, some children can't. They have to stay longer. But the beauty of it is that the child is growing, the child has rosy cheeks, they're playing sports, they're recovering from their mental illnesses, they're recovering from their physical illnesses. And they are not eating any plants at all. I have adults with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia who cannot eat any plants. They've been on this diet for years. Every time they try anything from the plant kingdom, they get ill again. And they stop. F5 babies, food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome. It's another epidemic coming in. This is a terrible, terrible condition in babies. Babies die from this condition. They live on this plant, on this diet, on a no-plant diet. So from my clinical perspective, I know human beings can live perfectly healthily without plants at all. We don't need plants to live and to be healthy and to be well. And not only we don't need them, we can actually be much healthier without plants. from my point of view.
My first year on carnivore, I was able to successfully end my seizures. But I started eating carbs again and my seizures returned. This is my second year around and I'm doing much, much better.